So I'm Alice DeWolf. I'm a board member of the Sentinel Educational Foundation, and I'm co-hosting this event with Dolores Broughton and Zoe Blunt, who are editors of the Watershed Sentinel magazine. As we're settling in, it would be great if you could take a minute to let us know in the chat where you're based, the land and the Indigenous people that you acknowledge. And, as with many of these events, if you're having any difficulties, let us know in the chat. The session is being recorded and it'll be available on the Watershed Sentinel website, www.watershedsentinel.ca. We are hosting this event from the unceded territory of the Comox First Nation that includes the Pentlach, the Yixan, the Sasitla, the Hehe, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We recognize that we weren't invited to settle here and that we must constantly work to reconcile this and to honor and appreciate the original people's experience, their generosity, and their traditions. They teach us that the land, the air, the water around us, their beauty, their abundance, and their ferocity are inseparable from our well-being as individuals and as community. So we hope this session will provide you with more information and resources related to the minerals that the Canadian government and others have declared to be critical, quote unquote, to both our defense and our economic futures. We are, as many have said, on the cusp of another gold rush. The transition to electrification requires the extraction of minerals that will come with big ecological and social costs. Just like 4 related stories from this week's news. It's 10 years since Canada's worst mining waste disaster at Mount Powley, when Imperial Mine's tailing pond collapsed and poured into Canal Lake. And today, the Mount Powley mine is still in operation, and the company proposes to use and enlarge that same holding pond. Another study indicates that significant amounts of mining-related arsenic were released in Yellowknife's 2023 wildfires. Yesterday, another 6 Treaty 9 members, First Nation members, joined Grassy Narrows First Nations in challenges to Ontario's mining legislation. And yesterday, 25,000 people demonstrated in opposition to a lithium mine in Belgrade, Serbia. Because we're based, so that's just in this week's news, right? Because we are based on the West Coast, we've focused today's discussion on issues and campaigns as they relate to this side of the continent. But we recognize that this issue has an impact on the land and communities right across the country. 3 people who are with us bring tremendous experience and knowledge. We'll start with Jamie Neen from Mining Watch Canada. Jamie will introduce us to what are considered to be critical minerals and the issues related to their mining. James Herbert will describe what this has begun to look like in Kafla territory in northern British Columbia. The Kafla First Nation has successfully challenged BC's free entry mining system in court and has required the province to abide by its own declaration on the rights of Indigenous people. And Nikki Skoos will introduce us to the BC Mining Reform Network and what actions we can take to reform BC's mining laws. So we'll take a few minutes for questions after our guests have spoken. And, as we're going through, you're welcome to put your questions in the chat during their presentations. So Dolores, I'm going to turn this over to you and to Zoe.
Right. I'm Dolores, and I've been the editor of the Watershed Sentinel for about 30 some years. And now I'm really pleased to introduce our new editor, Zoe Blunt, who's joining our team. And Zoe's going to introduce some people, and I'm going to go into the background and look for questions to pull together so that after the 3 panelists speak, we'll be ready with amalgamated questions from the vast hordes of people attending this meeting. Zoe is a dedicated activist and a great editor, so we're really happy to have her join us. Zoe.
Thank you very much, Dolores. And thank you, Alice, for putting this all together and all of the people who are making this possible today. I am very pleased to introduce Jamie Neen, co-founder of Mining Watch Canada, where he is Communication and Strategy Coordinator. Since 1999, they've been supporting communities here and around the world in coming to terms with the impacts of mining. Jamie is responsible for research and advocacy here and overseas, as well as Canadian uranium mining and environmental assessment policy and practice. Jamie knows community and environmental groups well and is active with the Canadian Environmental Network. He knows the Canadian mining industry likely as well as anyone in the country. And he's had a good look at Canadian mining policy, having served on the federal Environment and Climate Change Ministers Advisory Committee on Environmental Assessment, and previously on the Ministers Regulatory Advisory Committee on the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. And Jamie is with us today from Ottawa. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you, Zoe. And just a welcome here from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory in the east. And just one more thing I'll add is that I'm also here as the co-chair of the BC Mining Law Reform Network, which is a project that we've been working on for several years now in the wake of the Mount Polley disaster, but building on, I think, a long history of mining issues in BC and efforts to change mining policy so that these things don't keep happening. And I'm going to share my screen if that's okay, and start off with a question. Are we in a new gold rush? Are critical minerals the new gold rush? And that's going to open up the question of, well, what are we talking about in terms of critical minerals, but also what does the gold rush reference mean? And I'll start with that because I think people are probably vaguely familiar with it, but we're still seeing very much the footprints and echoes of the gold rush in mining policy and mining activity in BC in particular. In terms of the way the industry is governed, in terms of the way the industry operates, and the idea that really, getting this stuff out of the ground is really important and good. And that's the ethos that we're seeing coming back to the fore with the critical minerals discussion, the idea that we absolutely have to have this stuff. And that's where I want to go into, well, what are we actually talking about here? And the definitions are pretty variable. So if you look across different jurisdictions, the US, different provinces, even the European Union, different jurisdictions have different criteria about what they consider a critical mineral. The federal definition, the current federal definition, because that's also a moving target, is that the supply chain is threatened. So in other words, we might run out or not be able to get hold of the stuff that we need. And also that Canada is actually producing or might be able to produce the substance in question. So, there's no point declaring something critical and really trying to pursue it in Canada if it doesn't exist here. And I think that's just recognizing that reality. But it must also meet another criteria, one of the three, that it's essential for economic or national security, whatever that means, that it's required for the national transition to a sustainable, low carbon and digital economy, which is, I think, what most people understand as critical, that the existential crisis of climate change is what we're actually trying to address. And that if we're going to declare mining as a critical activity, it better be for that purpose and not for anything else. But then they also add that we want to position ourselves as a sustainable and strategic partner with global supply chains. So in other words, if we can supply Europe or the US or one of our other trading partners, our favored, our friendly trading partners, then that becomes a criteria for making something critical. And that you know, I can go into this in depth, but obviously I'm a little skeptical of these criteria, but also more deeply, you know, even if we focus in on the question of the sustainable low carbon and digital economy, you know, what does that mean? And what is mining's role in making that happen? So let me see here. Moving along to why this is important, and the question of what difference does it make to call mining critical or to call a mineral critical. uh, does a couple of things, and importantly, it unlocks government policy. It unlocks an agenda of deregulation, of streamlining or cutting red tape. So looking at the actual regulatory requirements for mining, and you know, things like how much of a review are we going to do of the engineering and the planning for these projects? Things that, you know, some of us consider pretty bloody important are among the things that get short-circuited. We've already seen this in Ontario, and I think we're seeing hints at that both federally and in other jurisdictions. BC, of course, declares that it has the best regulations, and we know that that's not true. And we keep pushing them to make that better. And I think Nikki will probably talk a bit more about that. But you know, the fact is that we're not in a position to say that we don't need as much oversight as we have of the technical aspects of mining. We need more. I mean, the recommendations of the Mount Polley report Mount Polley inquiry have not all been, in fact, mostly have not been implemented. Some of them are really not implemented, and you know, and the other thing is cutting public and Indigenous involvement, which is again something that the industry would really love, that government might find convenient because they're really bad at it anyway, but you know, something that I don't think our communities are going to put up with. And the other aspect of this is that it unlocks financial support. It unlocks subsidies, infrastructure investment, and direct investment in mining projects. So the federal government and the U.S. Department of Defense, interestingly, have been putting money upfront into mining projects. And you know, predictably, I think they've chosen really questionable ones to start with. It'd be nice to think they could do better, but apparently not. And so they're just creating more controversy and more conflict by doing this. The other big area that I think is really important is the propaganda aspect. And you know, if something's declared critical, well, that kind of takes the wind out of the sails of opposition. So people are critical of the impact of a proposed new mine or an expansion of an existing mine in a watershed, on biodiversity, on endangered species, on people's livelihoods. You know, these are all things that you know, now we'll hear, well, that's all very nice, but you know, we actually absolutely need this mining to go ahead to address the climate crisis. And you know, it kind of makes it really difficult for communities or experts or anybody else to stand up and say, well, wait a minute, we need to look at these things much more carefully. And it also has an important function, I think, in a similar vein of distracting from the climate action that we can take and really need to take at this moment. You know, the urgent and real climate solutions that are, you know, available to us that don't require more mining, but actually require reorganizing the way we do things, addressing waste and overconsumption, addressing inefficiency, and looking at how to live within our means on this planet. So then, you know, getting into the details, well, if we look at Canada's critical minerals list, it's pretty extensive. It includes what I would consider things that are basically just commodities like aluminum and potash and now, yeah, iron ore and or copper, which, you know, things that are not in short supply, things where the supply chains are not actually very delicate or unstable. You know, things like aluminum that Canada doesn't actually produce. We smelt it because we've got cheap hydropower, but we don't have bauxite in Canada. We don't mine it here. And and then there's another question around, what are all these things for? And we see, obviously iron ore is used in building wind turbines and so on, or electric vehicles, but it's, is it critical? I don't know. If we're talking about about focusing on the energy transition, then, you know, the battery metals, the elements that are needed for that kind of technology are important, but we've got them now mixed up with all these other things, and it makes it really hard to have I think, an intelligent kind of policy discussion. If we look at where Canada's promoting this, it's all over the place. It's the federal government's put out this critical minerals map, and it shows all these dots all over the map of things that you kind of figure are critical because they're labeled that way. Well, I took the liberty of digging into this. One of the things that's really interesting about this is how much of this is prospective. So you see the blue dots are not actual mines. They're mining projects that are in different stages of development, and some of them might be close to actually becoming mines, and many of them never will be. We look at this, or they're like the Ring of Fire in Ontario, where there are huge deposits there, but whether they will ever and should ever get developed is a whole different question. And then, looking at some of the specifics, it's just, a lot of these are, as I say, they're sort of speculative, and in a way, what the mining industry and what the governments are doing is playing into this gold rush mentality of promoting mining projects that may or may not exist or may not ever come to fruition, but we can make a lot of money off them in the meantime by selling shares and reselling things and pumping up the price. And, if it collapses, well, then, some people made a lot of money and have walked away doing well, and that's how you make money out of a gold rush. It's not out of actually mining the gold. But if you strip away all of that, all of those exploration projects, well, first of all, let's strip away all of the projects that are not critical minerals, and that makes the map look very different all of a sudden. We pull out all the copper mines, we pull out all of the gold mines in particular, and coal. I've actually pulled out the iron ore mines as well, but there's only a couple of them in the sort of Quebec-Labrador trough there by Schefferville. So what we're looking at now is some copper, molybdenum, various projects, and only some that are actually in production, and a number that are potentially happening, maybe not. And the whole exercise looks much more now like promotion than like any real economic development plan. And I think that's not accidental. So just to wrap up, I wanted to put this in context as well of the planetary boundaries. I don't know, people may have seen this, came out last year from the Stockholm Resilience Center, but they've done now, I think there's third iteration of this assessment, and each time they do it more precisely and break it down further, and each time it looks worse in terms of what humanity's impact on water, on chemical flows, on biodiversity. And it turns out that in terms of what the planet can actually handle, we're doing okay in terms of stratospheric ozone depletion because we've actually got an effective regulatory system on that. Ocean acidification is approaching danger levels, and we know that. And that's also related to climate change, of course. And then other areas we're really pushing it. And so all of this is just to say that addressing the climate crisis is a key part of what we need to do collectively, economically, socially, politically, as humans, as human societies. But is integrated with, I mean, it's a key part of a lot of these other issues, but it is a key part of addressing, you know, our economic and ecological impact on the planet. So, you know, coming back to the question of demand, you know, should we be pushing for more mining and more material and business as usual, and we'll just get everyone into electric cars and get everything electrified and just keep wasting masses of material and energy? Or are we going to actually shift our economic priorities and the way we organize ourselves in terms of how we use these resources and what kind of responsibility we take? Because at the end of the day, mining of critical minerals is still just mining. You know, it depends, the details differ, you know, it depends where you are and what you're mining, but it is disruptive. It creates massive amounts of toxic waste because most of what's produced is waste, not actual metals. And the difference is just the presentation, the justification, the propaganda aspect, you know, because now we're being told we need these materials for the low carbon economy, for the energy transition. And I have to say that making that transition is absolutely critical, but mining is not. And what's critical is clean water. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, Jamie, thank you. That's not an easy thing to do, to summarize.
Did I make it in 10 minutes?
No,
No.
but it's all right. But it's not an easy thing to do, to summarize it, because this is huge. This is a huge issue, and we're all, you know, we're all sort of facing it, and I really appreciate that as an introduction into sort of many future conversations, and for us to all understand to some extent what's happening sort of around us, um, uh, and and now I'm going to introduce us to James Herbert, who's senior advisor with the CAFA Territorial Management Agency in northern, for those who don't live here, sort of middle British Columbia. He's been working with the hereditary and elected leadership as the community's been dealing with the fallout of poor mining practices and their continued fight to have their own inherent and unceded laws and values recognized by the colonial governments. James' work has focused particularly on regulatory reform, Indigenous governance, and impact assessment. James, thank you for being with us. I think you're from Ucluelet today, but most of your work is from Prince Rupert-ish territory, right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm coming to you from Ucluelet territory on the west coast of what's now Vancouver Island. But I have, for the last going on 10 years, had the honor of working for Kikatla Nation on BC's north coast. And you can see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. And so you, Alex mentioned, I appreciate Jamie taking the brunt of the work of talking about the critical mineral strategy. It's not an easy thing to encapsulate. And what I'm going to do, under the premise of the best predictor of future behavior being past behavior, I'm going to talk a little bit about Kikatla's experience with mining and mineral exploration in the territory and some of the work the nation has been undergoing to try to correct some of that past behavior. I'll start with a little bit of context around the nation, and then we'll get into some of the bad mining practices and talk about the case that the nation brought forward against BC's Mineral Tenure Act a little bit as well. And then I'll pass it off. Hopefully I will stay within my own time, and my apologies if I gloss over stuff. I can come back to stuff in questions. For those of you who don't know, Kikatla is a nation on the north coast of BC. It's occupied in the Great Bear Rainforest. which is most of the entire Northern Shelf bioregion of British Columbia. And it's, I mean, frankly, a simply wonderful ecosystem. It provides like a huge amount of biodiversity, some really important keystone species. The ecology of the area is amazing. And most importantly, at least for I think settlers to keep in mind, is that ecology and that ecosystem has been managed since time immemorial, quite literally from the point of when it was an ecosystem. It has been managed by the people who live and work and survive in that ecosystem. And that for Kikatla territory is these gentlemen here. They are my boss. I joke often that I'll have something between 25 and 35 bosses because it is the hereditary table and matriarchs that I am responsible to. And they have just been a shining light of good, productive work trying to get back to the idea of managing an ecosystem. And so while we're talking about this little piece of this, it's important to keep in mind that the nation itself sees the entire ecosystem as part of their management obligations. Unfortunately, numbers of bad practices across the territory have chewed up and made it hard to continue that management. I'm going to talk about one of them on an island in the middle of the territory that's called now Banks Island. In Spanish, it's called Lac des Anneaux, and that's the name for the territory that is covered by Banks Island. And there has been a history of mining at this one site going back to like 1930s, but I'm going to talk about the most recent mining there. I'm going to walk us through a little bit of where we see a failure in the regulatory process and how that led us to the MTA case. So I'm going to, starting big, drawing everyone's attention into Banks Island, which frankly is a beautiful chunk of land in the Great Bear Rainforest, and sustains quite a lot of ecological diversity. The coastline alone around Banks Island is entirely worth exploring. It's absolutely beautiful, and I feel privileged that I've had the chance to go out there and experience it. It has sustained upwards of 20 to 30,000 Kikatla members before colonization and the decimation of population that happened after contact. So by its very nature, the resources are sustainable. It's sustainable for a lot more people than currently are there too. And so I think it's just a really cool context to think about as you manage these resources that are sustainable. And then unfortunately, we plopped down a mine kind of right in the middle of the island. And so this is the mine site as it looks today. This is the mine site as we are currently dealing with it. There's a lot of leftover infrastructure. There's a lot of unremediated tailings ponds. There's open pits that flood and deflood over the day, over the year. It's without griping on it too much, it is a mess sitting in the middle of one of the most beautiful islands I've ever been to. And so it's kind of disheartening. And it has been an issue with the nation that has been a strong concern of them since I've been working with. And so while we've been dealing with this and while we've been looking at the mining practice and while we did a review, not just on how we can look forward and fix it, but how we got to this position, the nation took a look at the regulatory process that got them there. And so this is, I think, really important for people who don't live in the regulatory world to understand. This is from the Ontario Mining Association. It's a really nice picture of how they see the regulatory process. It is for Ontario, not for BC, but at this high level, it's basically the same thing. And so we go through a very similar, there's exploration, there's evaluation, what we would call impact assessment and applications. There's early construction and building of a mine, there's commercial production of a mine, and then there is closing and reclamation of it hypothetically. We very rarely get to that last point, but what we did is looked at the process that got us as a nation into the mess we're currently in on Banks Island. And if I could relabel them, we weren't consulted in stage one, so we had no idea that these explorations were happening, except for randomly seeing helicopters fly over and occasionally finding some boreholes. When we were eventually consulted, our concerns were generally ignored or overrun by the regulatory process. We definitely had our statement of non-consent to the mine operating completely and utterly ignored. And then during that fourth thing, we had the mining company break 32 conditions of their permits. So they broke 32 conditions of their permits and basically did everything we were worried they would do when we voiced concerns in stage 2 and 3. They ended up doing in stage 4. We were left with a broken set of regulatory processes, and we are stuck, tied up in a bunch of bureaucratic catch-22s around trying to move to step 5. And so all of those issues and all of that concern that happened on Banks Island happened in 2014, and that mine still looks like those pictures I showed you today, because we are tied up in some nebulous gray area between steps 4 and 5. Which puts us on a list of Jamie's group's report on the BC mining law reforms, Dirty Dozen, BC's top most polluting mines, which is not a list we want to be on. It's not a list I'm assuming that group wants to continue to do, but they continue to do it, and we're grateful that they continue to draw attention to it. If you haven't read the Dirty Dozen report, I recommend you go and do them. In fact, there's 2 of them, I believe, and they're really fun to compare because there hasn't been much movement between the 2 reports, sadly. But it's interesting to note where all of this work has led you to, and where people are stuck with a lot of this stuff, especially dealing with the consequences of mining. And so while we were doing that, I'm going to focus a little bit more on attacking the problem at both the start of it and the end of it. And today I'm going to talk mostly about our solution for attacking the problem at the start, which, if you remember, was step 1, where we weren't consulted or engaged. So we looked at the Mineral Tenure Act itself. We talked to a lot of people who were hotly involved in this conversation. And what we came to the conclusion is that we had a very good case to go to the BC Supreme Court and say, you gave away the nation's mineral rights without consent. I am not going to belabor this thing too much. There have been very good pieces on this case written in a number of different places, including Watershed Sentinel. So I recommend people go and read those articles for more detail. But in brief, the no mineral rights without consent argument was that Indigenous rights and titles includes mineral rights, and that granting rights to a corporation without consent is an impact on those rights and title, both under Section 35 and in BC's new commitment to uphold the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Therefore, granting the right would require consultation because it could be an impact. We will go one step further and say it needs consent, but given the constraints of a Western legal system, we argued you both need consultation and consent. And so the nation decided to go after this, and about, again, not belaboring this case, 3 years of intense work from a huge number of people, including 35 hereditary chiefs and matriarchs. And many people talking today, huge supports from Raven, from Nikki's organization, from Jamie's organization, from mining companies themselves that have adopted DRIPA. We got support from all walks for this, and it was an incredible thing to see. It's the best work I've ever done in my career. It was incredibly good to do this. And in the end, we had historical legal decisions made on it that said, yes, they do have a duty to consult. Yes, they need to reform the oldest act sitting around in BC's legal books. And a number of op-ed pieces and conversations from all walks of life about what that means for mining going forward. Again, not belaboring this point. We also ended up with land use orders that have stopped mining on Banks Island and that have put a hold on granting tenures in the territory as we work through some of these issues with the community. It's not all good news to end on sort of a sad note, maybe leaning into Nikki's talk on what other work we have to do, we know as a nation that we're not done. There's still parts of the decision that we weren't particularly pleased with, and we think were legal errors. So we have appealed a number of them, all of them to do with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So the nation itself knows that it still has fight. It still has to drive this thing forward, and they're dedicated to doing that. We still have the mine site itself to deal with. We are still working on who's paying for it, what we have to do it. We are monitoring it. We are going out there frequently, but it's going to take millions and millions and millions of dollars to clean up, and it's going to have to be done correctly. And so we are working with a number of organizations on that. And then we also recognize that you don't just win a fight, other nations have to pick it up. It was mentioned I think Alice mentioned at the beginning of this, that there are legal challenges being brought forward in Ontario that pull very much on the decisions and the arguments that were made in BC. And so we recognize that this is a collective journey that we're on. And so hopefully that gives you a little past and our experiences with this. And I'll end there and just say I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you guys about it. So thank you.
Thank you, James. We are really grateful for this, for all your discussion about this. And I have posted links in the chat for everyone to both the first and the second edition of the Dirty Dozen, as well as our Watershed Sentinel reporting about the Gitga'la court case, which is, like you said, historic. It may change how BC does mining for the future. We'll see. So next I want to introduce Nikki Skuse, is the director of the Northern Confluence Initiative based in Wet'suwet'en Territory in Smithers, BC. She's a leading advocate for mining reforms that respect Indigenous laws, rights, and sustainability principles. She will introduce us to the BC Mining Law Reform Network, which she helped found along with Jamie. And that network is promoting changes to mineral development laws and mining practices to ensure they are environmentally sound, don't pollute waters, respect community decisions, and account for the costs to clean up toxic mine waste sites. Nikki, I think, is with us today from Smithers. Welcome, Nikki.
Thanks so much, Zoe, and thanks for having me. I'm just going to pull up my presentation. There we go. Yeah, thanks so much for this opportunity to join you today. I'm going to, I guess, sort of like piece together both James and Jamie's conversations and what happens in BC. So I think it's important to just add to what Jamie was talking about in terms of providing a bit of context into what BC actually mines, along with the advocacy and push for critical minerals. So as Jamie mentioned, Canada's list has 34 critical minerals with a focus on 6, lithium, graphite, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth elements. And BC is by far the biggest producer of copper in the country. We dig up more than 680 million pounds. And it accounts for nearly 60% of Canada's production. And for every ton of copper produced, they say there's at least 20 tons of waste. And what we've done across Canada also is we've mined all the easy stuff to get first. And so we're getting lower and lower grades. So there's more and more waste for what we're mining. Gold is not featured on Canada's critical mineral list, but it is commonly mined in BC. And the thing to note here, I think, of great importance is that with all the push for critical minerals, we still have about 60% of all mineral exploration is for gold. And so they will sort of try to maybe spin it and say gold is used for some technological applications, which is true, but only about 8% is used for that. The rest is used to just like put into those gold bars and store it in the basement of a bank or for jewelry. And so we have enough gold out there to recycle, reuse, that we don't actually need to gold mine. At the same time, it is true that in BC, often there's gold deposits found alongside of copper, in conjunction with copper. So, and then also we are a huge coal mining province, and so copper doesn't fully meet that definition that Jamie gave. It doesn't really face any supply chain disruptions. But I think in the future, what they're also looking at are some of the rare earth metals and nickel, which BC is not mining yet, but hopes to. And then just to connect with what James was talking about, today mining activity is still given priority over virtually all other land uses in British Columbia. So in fact, the process for staking a claim is super easy. You just have to be 18 years old. You get, you pay $25 and you get your free miner certificate. And then if you have access to a computer, you can go and click and claim for $1.75 a hectare almost anywhere without having to go there. So this includes private property, Indigenous lands, key tourism areas, important salmon habitat, municipal drinking water sources. Really it's only off limits in parks, certain archaeological sites, a few no registration reserves, which, as James was mentioning, Kitkatla just got a few added. And claims need to be a certain distance from dwellings. And so that's why it sort of eliminates urban areas. You have to be about 60 to 70 meters from a dwelling. So that, in essence, then the majority of BC is open, almost 80%. And so shown here is this couple from Kamloops who were reportedly drinking a glass of wine on their deck in 2019 when this free miner showed up to start digging around because he had the subsurface rights with his claim, and they had absolutely no recourse to stop the mining. The only requirement in our laws is that a deal be negotiated of some kind for compensation if there's going to be loss or damage. And so it's pretty egregious, I think, when people find out. And in fact, it's so egregious that there was this great stunt a few years ago that then former chief and author Bev Sellers, she wrote the book They Called Me Number One and Price Paid, which you should all read. But she decided to stake then Mine Minister Bennett's property in Cranbrook. And she was able to do so in less than an hour. She did call the Tanaha first to seek permission beforehand to get their consent. And in fact, after she did this, everybody was offering her equipment for free to start digging up his ranch, but she didn't take them up on that. But I think, really, as James said, unless we sort of modernize the Mineral Tenure Act and stop having it be treated as the highest and best use of the land, we'll have conflict. So this is, Indigenous rights. It is not consistent with DRIPA, as the Kitkatla have made the argument in courts and continue to as part of the appeal. But we see this all throughout when Indigenous rights are ignored, whether it's in Silkating country where Prosperity Mines kept trying to, just push their mine through, despite the nation repeatedly saying no, or in Tahltan territory where Fortune Minerals proposed a coal mine at the sacred headwaters of 3 major salmon rivers, with Juggernaut, who was evicted out of New Hawk territory, or we have right now also mineral claims that are preventing the conservation, the expansion of a conservation area in Gitineau territory, and elsewhere in the province. It really is one of the most colonial laws. And it is also very inconsistent with private property rights, municipal priorities, and land use plans. And given that critical minerals push, we are seeing the number of mineral claims in BC on the rise. Again, as I mentioned, the majority for gold. And so one of the things that the BC mining law reform did a few years ago, this has probably shifted and even increased. But we wanted to just look at certain areas, such as Northwest BC, which the industry calls the Golden Triangle, and some like the Klabana Keepers call the sacred headwaters, to just look at like how, what had been staked. And at this moment in time, and again, I'm sure it's increased, about 50% of the UNIC watershed is staked. And, really, when we also looked at the Fraser River, and from like Lytton to Hope, the majority of the Fraser River, even because there's a lot of placer claims, had been staked. So it's pretty eye-opening when you like look in different regions to just see how much mineral interest there are and that are increasing. And I think what's quite egregious is that we're now even seeing a lot more staking. Like the mining companies are coming in saying that they're saviors for climate change, and yet they're salivating at these melting glaciers, and they're staking on a bunch of them, which is kind of gross in my opinion. So the good news story here, though, is that given the Kakatla court case and all the pressures and just how archaic and colonial this free entry system is, and how much conflict it creates, we do have commitments for reforms. There's a court-mandated deadline to have consultation requirements by March of next year. And the province has also agreed to repeal and replace the Mineral Tenure Act, although on a, unfortunately, much longer timeline. And then, as sort of mentioned, one of the biggest challenges the mining industry faces is around waste and water. And there's no silver bullet solutions. There's just a bunch of better practices. So, BC had a big wake-up call in 2014, a decade ago, with the Mount Polley mine disaster. This was the largest environmental mining disaster in Canada's history. It really impacted local residents who used to use Quesnel Lake as a drinking water source and are no longer able to. The province did make some changes after this disaster. They had literally dwindled the department in inspections to bare minimums, and they did go on to hire more staff and increase inspections. They made a few changes to regulations and requirements, such as having independent tailings review boards. However, there's ongoing challenges and changes needed, and it's really hard to do this because really the province has this narrative that we have the strongest environmental regulations when it comes to mining, and industry consistently uses it. And so that's what James pointed out in the link in the chat to these Dirty Dozen reports, is that we've had to sort of like push back on that narrative and show like, all of the things that BC does not do well when it comes to mining. And just to sort of give that context too, so after the Mount Polley mine disaster happened, it was sort of really obvious that there was a gap that needed to be filled. So a lot of the environmental activism in British Columbia was around tankers and pipelines and climate change and protecting old growth. And all of those are really important and needed. But it was sort of seen that there weren't very many people working on mining issues. And so we pulled together a meeting with anybody and anyone who had ever done anything on mining or who could possibly be interested, or who are fighting a little community group fighting a mine in their backyard, and sort of pulled together to sort of assess interest. And then we got the U of Vic Environmental Law Center to do a review of our regulatory regime in British Columbia and look at all the mining laws and regulations, and come up with recommendations and what jurisdictions, did better and that we could learn from and pull from. And so that was really provided a strong foundation for the BC Mining Law Reform Network for groups to be able to sign on. And so we launched in 2019. We're approximately 30 different groups. And then we decided to focus because we had, I don't know, there's like over 100 recommendations, I think, in all of those mining law reform pushes. And so we really tried to focus on the Mineral Tenure Act reform, which is what I just said. And so we've got some priorities that we're pushing within this provincial reform process, as well as pushing for faster timelines. And we also focus on tailing safety and water pollution and ensuring the polluter pays. So this is an example of what the BC Mining Law Reform Network does too. We sometimes produce these products like this tailings map. So this is an interactive map on our website. And in essence, it's also an advocacy tool. We do government relations to try to push for the Mount Poly panel recommendations that made a recommendation to reduce the tailings inventory in order to get to a path to zero failures. And so we haven't seen any of that action taken up by the province. And there's these cumulative risks from tailings given just like overall volumes of tailings waste, the facility heights and storage volumes, how they're classified, and climate change all exacerbates these risks. Like when you have atmospheric rivers or heat domes or droughts, like all of these sort of impact and have the potential to potentially impact watersheds. And so this is sort of something that we might use in our activism. And it is really hard because both, like, as I mentioned, there's no silver bullet when it comes to tailings of water. There are just better practices. It gets wonky fast. And I think people get, maybe that we should have these no-go zones. So let's not put big tailings facilities right above a community or right at a salmon watershed. I think like people sort of understand that. And so those are some of the things that the BC Mining Law Reform Network does. We challenge the narrative around having the best environmental regulations. We sort of educate people. We provide resources that try to be very fact-based and come up with solutions. We always have recommendations for things that need to happen. And as Jamie mentioned too, we do need to transition, absolutely. And so the other part of our priority now is sort of broadening that conversation. We need to push for mining reforms and more responsible practices if we are going to open up new mines, but we also need to, we're in a biodiversity crisis and we need to, protect areas. We need to reduce the compensation costs to those with mineral claims in those areas that, Indigenous people want protected. And we need to improve in terms of what's already on the landscape. And as James mentioned, we have a legacy of a ton of abandoned mine sites that need to be cleaned up. So the BC Mining Law Reform Network will continue to advance these priorities. We are pretty small. We have a bunch of resources, and we have a monthly, mostly monthly newsletter. So it's not tons of stuff that also sometimes have calls to action. So you can join that, and I'll put that in the chat. So, and then I'll leave it for questions.
Go ahead, Alice. You can unmute yourself and introduce the next section.
Right. That's so Nikki, thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for the concerted work that you've been doing. And actually, thanks to all of you, because you've condensed some very like a huge amount of work and some very important information into a short and accessible kind of set of presentations. And so again, we really appreciate the work that you've been doing. We're going to open for questions for a few minutes now. Quickly put them in the chat if you haven't already done so. Zoe and Boris are going to select a couple of questions to start. And again, you're going to find more information at miningwatch.ca, at reformbcmining.ca, at the watershedsentinel.ca, and at Raven Trust, has recently produced several related podcasts and interviews. So Dolores and Zoe, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. First, I want to start with a comment from Caroline back at the beginning. She said, "So glad Jamie pointed out water is the most critical substance on Earth." And of course, that's what's at risk with a lot of these mining issues. So there is, for those who don't know where the chat and Q&A icons are, they are at the bottom of the screen. You may have to move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen in order to see where you can type it in. So we have a couple of questions from the Q&A that Jamie Neen has gone ahead and answered, but perhaps would like to expand on more. Megan asks first, wondering about the use of critical minerals by the fossil fuel industry in their processing of oil and gas production. And Jamie, would you like to expand on that, or any of the other panelists like to jump in on that question?
Okay.
Well, I can sort of take it in a slightly different direction just to say that energy is actually one of the mining industry's biggest costs. And we're now seeing a push for increased automation and electrification of mining itself. So there's some kind of circularity to that, some kind of irony to that, that mining will be using more electricity and less diesel, but it's still mining. So, but it just points to, I think, the fact that the mining industry itself has a pretty big greenhouse gas footprint. And in addition to its impacts on biodiversity, on hydrology and so on, it has serious climate impacts just by itself.
Right. It someone commented that it's like we're building the mines to build the machines to build the machines of the future. And that's the kind of circularity that we're in right now. Megan also asks, and again, this is answered by Jamie in the Q&A section here at the bottom of the screen, asking about DRIPA, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and is that in effect in British Columbia in law, and asking whether its implementation was delayed after it became law.
Maybe
James, you should
James can
answer.
talk about what that actually means or what the court said about it, because it's kind of interesting.
So that's Jamie's answer, which points out that the Declaration Act action plan took a long time to come out, is entirely correct. What's interesting is that there is significant debate even from the start with that act. And I'm talking about the BC Act on the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People here. There was debate about what the act actually means. And when push came to shove in court, the province argued that the only thing the law does is require them to make an action plan and report on the action plan. Very similar to those of you who may be familiar with the climate action plan, which when taken to court and push come to shove, the government argued they didn't have to do anything but talk about how they might need to do an action plan. There was a lot of arguments in court about how the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act actually didn't make DRIPA the law of the land. I mentioned that we were still in court around some stuff. That is very much what we are still in court around. And so we entirely disagree with the judgment that agreed with the province and their arguments that the DRIPA action plan was not in fact judiciable. And so we're confident that we'll continue to do that. There has been federal case law about it through the Montour and the Children's Protection Act, Children's Welfare Act, that align with our arguments. And we're looking sometime, hopefully in January and February, to have that particular case decided by the BC Court of Appeals. Although timelines are always, don't quote me on timelines, because legal timelines, nobody has any control over.
All right. We have one more question from the Q&A from Carla, who asks, what can we do? Open-ended question.
Well, if you can join, so you can join the BC Mining Law Reform Network. There's, I don't think I, as a presenter, for some reason, can share in the chat, but I could share on the Q&A. And we have some actions, and then we have a monthly newsletter that will alert you to actions or give you an update of, like, for example, like where the Mineral Tenure Act reform is going and suggestions when there are like openings to comment or submit things. Then we'll provide some guidance. Like the BC, again, we're gonna, with the election coming up, there'll be a bit of delay on certain things, but BC is producing like a critical minerals report. And they had a first, go, and we provided lots of comments to try to push BC to broaden the conversation, not just be about new mining, respect, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, repeal the Mineral Tenure Act, these sorts of things. And so we're helpful. we help do that. It's not overwhelming. Like, as I mentioned, we do have a listserv that can be, but we have this is just about around a monthly newsletter that also sometimes provides links. And there are actions currently on our website. We just submitted actually the Mineral Tenure Act petition in June to Minister Osborne. As part of, we had also done some polling as part of just showing support for mineral tenure reforms, for what it was worth, from citizens of British Columbia. So we do follow through on on these actions. James, I don't know if there's still also an open Raven fundraiser for your appeal, or if that's.
There is, totally. And I would add to Nikki's point about being very active, especially settlers who are listening in on this and people from settler descent communities. The government is very much aware of the fact that they are in an election year, and they are nervous about dissenting opinions, both against reform current acts, because everyone goes cautious in election years, and the vocal opposition to stuff like the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And so the louder support voices are heard, the easier it becomes to push from all sides and move that giant boulder slowly up the hill. So I'll just echo, like, get involved through Nikki's network, get involved from local networks. That's always my advice to people when they ask how to help.
Great. Thank you. I've got one more comment from Megan, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dolores, who has some follow-up questions. If we have time, Alice,
No, we
let
don't.
me know. No more time. Okay, well, the comment from Megan is asking the groups who are represented here to make up a list of questions we could ask candidates for this year's provincial election that pertain to mining, to really put the pressure on them. So thank you for that, Megan.
I'm looking at Nikki, and I think that's something that we can be working on as the BC Mining Law Reform Network, in whatever form that takes, but definitely putting those issues out in that kind of format.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that there's so much nostalgia about mining that it doesn't really matter what political party that you're a part of. You tend to support mining, which again, is part of that. Let's go to Barkerville and pan for gold, even though smallpox wiped out most of the indigenous population. There's just like stories that are told and not told, and so there's broad support. For mining, often with all political parties, but it would be great if people could help raise that in debates, and we'll follow up on that.
Well, I think we have to stop just as we were getting really hot and interesting here. But I want to thank all of our presenters very, very much. And the Sentinel Educational Foundation that has helped present this webinar, and also, I believe, helped sponsor our feature section in the Watershed Sentinel called Heavy Metal. And I'd also like to thank all the Indigenous peoples who are working so hard to help us change this horrible legacy. And I'd like to thank all of our audience for listening and thinking and asking questions. Okay. And have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.